Thank you so much all for coming. I'm not completely sure how competent I am because I'm really diverging from my areas of psychology, philosophical anthropology, and the metaphysics of hylomorphism to talk about these topics. But Father Richard and I were really interested in all these topics, and I thought it'd be a good time for me to try to get my feet wet and speciate for my research interests into something different. As I got into the topic, and as I proposed this topic, hylomorphism and evolution in 4 dimensions, about a year ago, I didn't realize, as one often doesn't, how much I didn't know and how many things I had to work through. So if there's time, I'm going to get to evolution in 4 dimensions at the very end, which is a part of the extended evolutionary synthesis. So it's one version of the extended evolutionary synthesis. But I realized I had a lot of problems and questions that I hadn't resolved in my own mind about the compatibility of hylomorphism with biological speciation. So most of my talk is me working through a lot of that, and it's pretty thin on argument and a lot of hand-waving. It's pretty heavy on the hand-waving. So hopefully, I know there's some sharpshooters here who will zoom in their laser beams on those parts as the talk develops. I'm first going to talk about this overall and introduce this problem of reconciling two conceptions of species and speciation. And then I'm going to focus in on hylomorphism. And I realized I had to think through some issues about the role of natural kinds, especially biological natural kinds, and what relationship they have to hylomorphism. Fortunately, there's been some pretty good work on that, and I'm adopting a lot of the things that people like David Oderberg and Travis Dumsday have had to say about this. I'm going to have a few comments about ontogeny, about individual development, and phylogeny, the development and the changes and the diversification of a species, and then a little bit about why essentialism is or is not different from, or has problems with evolution. I'm specifically focusing on hylomorphic essentialism, so if essentialism in general has a problem, hylomorphic essentialism especially has a problem too. Then I'm going to focus on what I'm calling adductive speciation, which is going to be my account for the type of substantial change that occurs in hylomorphism when a new hylomorphic species, a new substance that hasn't yet existed, comes into being. And then if there's time, I'm going to talk about that ends with the most hand-waving part of what would the criteria be for when this has happened and not happened. And I'm going to gesture with waving arms, like a bird that eventually learns to fly, towards evolution in 4 dimensions and the extended evolutionary synthesis as, I think, providing some ways of filling out what the criteria would be here, but also to make a comment on hylomorphists need to be selective about what their conversation partners are in the various biological sciences, a lesson I had to learn in neuroscience and psychology. Not all these theories are created equally, and they often come from deep metaphysical or other worldview assumptions. And so some of them you might need to engage in order to criticize and refute, but they're not necessarily going to be the best partners for a constructive project. And so I'm basically saying focusing on selfish gene and that kind of thing is not the approach that you want to focus on for developing a constructive hylomorphic approach to evolution. It's going to be something like evolution in 4 dimensions. Now, this isn't a polished talk, and I apologize for that. I have, the first excuse was that I'm in a new area and didn't know how much I didn't know before I started. The second is my wife and I just, she delivered our own little hylomorphic substance about a week ago, and this is Sophia Therese, and we just came from the hospital on Tuesday, so I'm a bit haggard. So if this feels like a fire hose of information all over the place that's not very organized, it probably is. So first I want to make a point about our forms of classification, and that there's different explananda, different things that need to be explained, and we might do that for the same, one and the same organism might admit of a plurality of true descriptions and true explanations, depending on the way in which we're approaching those individuals, those entities, those realities. So I think we should adopt a pluralism. Sometimes pluralism becomes just an overwhelming conventionalism in the philosophy of science, and I'm arguing for a more realistic, parsimonious pluralism. Do not multiply classification schemes without necessity, and they all need to be truth-tracking. So we should distinguish between the ways in which there are things that need to be explained by ontological explanations, so ontological explananda, and things that need to be explained by the modification and the amplification of our empirical investigations by experimental and other scientific inquiries. So there are going to be different ontological and scientific conceptions of species, because they're explaining different things about biological organisms, and they are likely to have different conceptions of speciation. So hylomorphic essentialist speciation is not necessarily going to be the same thing as biological evolutionary speciation. And we need to figure out how they're related to each other. And part of the challenge related to hylomorphic essentialism is, can they even put forward an account of speciation that's compatible with biological evolutionary accounts of speciation? But they all need to truthfully track, describe, and explain different explananda concerning the reality of changing biological organisms. So there are a lot of different rival concepts of ontological species. And being an Aristotelian Thomist, I'm defending a version of a hylomorphic version of ontological species. I'll come back to hylomorphism, but I am presuming quite a bit of familiarity, I'm sorry, already about hylomorphism. So a hylomorphic species attempts to ontologically explain the substantial formal actuality, unity, and the grounding of a panoply of attributes, including the propria that are detailed by natural kinds. And these are shaped by, these are all shared by biological organisms of the same essence. Whereas the scientific species concepts, and again that's in the plural too, just like there's a plurality of conflicting or not necessarily conflicting ontological species concepts, there's also a plurality of scientific species concepts. And they all attempt to explain empirically discoverable similarities and dissimilarities among changing biological organisms that somehow or other unite them as members of the same biological natural kind. I'm there somewhat begging the question, because there are some of these that actually reject natural kinds altogether, and the only kind of species concepts for science are ones that don't involve natural kinds. But we're not going to get into that debate. Down here I have some examples. Here are some of the prominent scientific biological species concepts. The first is Ernest Meyer's biological species concept, which is a bit misleading because the other ones are also biological species concepts, so he sort of took the whole territory over by giving it that term. People like Peter Godfrey Smith say, for that reason, we should probably refer to it more as a reproductive community species concept. And the central thing that they think is crucial for explaining species membership is answering the question, who can you breed with? So a population of organisms that can successfully interbreed and produce fertile offspring. That's what constitutes a reproductive community concept of a species. They have their reproductively isolated interbreeding population. They're isolated from reproducing with others, but within the population they can reproduce. A more specific version of this one that tries to get around some of the objections and problems with it is a genetic species concept. So that just hones in on a genetically isolated interbreeding population. So it might not have to do with sex selection or some of these other factors. It's just due to the fact that their genes are not going to be able to produce any sort of offspring. They're not going to be able to fertilize. Very differently are the phylogenetic species concepts. And here they're asking a different kind of question that they think is relevant, oftentimes because of some of the objections that are given to the biological species concept. They want to answer questions like, who are your ancestors and your descendants? That's what's crucial for species membership. So not who can you breed with, but who are you bred from, as Peter Godfrey Smith puts it. So this is a population of organisms that are connected by a unique ancestry or lineage. Speciation here occurs whenever there's a phylogenetic branching event. Another concept is the ecological species concept. So this has to do with the population of organisms or of species if they share a distinct ecological niche which shapes and ecologically isolates phenetic groups of organisms. There are well-known substantive objections and problems with all of these definitions. None of them have garnered universal consensus. The biological species concept has been enormously influential, especially for the modern evolutionary synthesis. But as Meyer and others who put this forth all admit, it doesn't cover asexual reproduction. They don't see that as a problem because it's only trying to give a species concept for this one area of sexually reproducing populations. So I'm going to focus on this biological species concept, and I'm not going to treat those other ones. I'm not saying we shouldn't treat those other ones. I'm just showing you how incomplete the inquiry is that I'm doing here. I'm only trying to set up a clear account of how you would reconcile a hylomorphic account of speciation with this specifically reproductive community or biological species concept of speciation, okay? So those other areas and those other kinds of concepts of species would also have to independently be treated for hylomorphic species concept to be considered one that could handle all the different forms of biological speciation. So here I have just a brief summary of what are the differences then between these two concepts just on their face of things. The hylomorphic species concept is an ontological concept. We don't establish it by doing empirical investigations in a really controlled way. It does presume being informed empirically, but in the most basic fundamental sense. And it's established on that basis via metaphysical analysis of physical composite individual entities, of their attributes, and of their accidental changes and their substantial forms of change. So it's through an analysis of the way in which all physical things change in accident or conjugate ways, and the ways in which they change substantially. That's how you arrive at a metaphysical analysis, amongst other things. You might look at composition and other things of hylomorphism. Individual organisms of the same species, they all share the same hylomorphic essence, which is comprised of the same substantial form animating its matter. And its species concept, the hylomorphic species concept, it applies to all animate or living physical substances. Very differently, the biological species concept is a scientific concept. It's established via scientific inquiries, things like population genetics. And as Meyer says, this is his definition: species are groups of actually or potentially interbreeding natural populations that are reproductively isolated from other such groups. I think it was around the 1960s that Meyer decided to drop the potential there. So that's why I've X'd it out, is because he later iterations up into, I think his last major publications are 2002. He lived, I think, to be 100 years old and published up until 2002 or 2003 when he passed away. So he nixed the potentially for a number of reasons that kind of is too broad for really honing in. But importantly, as I noted before, this species concept only applies to sexually reproducing biological organisms. So you can already begin to see some of the contrasts between these different types of species concepts. And they're also going to then answer different versions of the question, why do certain individual organisms belong to the same species? The explanation the hylomorphic species is giving is each of these individual organisms has the same substantial formal actuality, unity, and grounding of a panoply of properties in virtue of having the same hylomorphic essence. So that's how it's going to answer that question. The scientific species concepts of scientific explanation are going to say what makes them all the same species is that empirical investigations have established that each of these individual organisms is able to interbreed with other individual organisms within the same population because they're not reproductively isolated from each other. Okay. So now I want to go a little bit deeper, not too deep actually, on how speciation is understood given the biological species concept. I'm not going to keep making the qualification that I'm just focused on Meyer, because that was going to, you're going to get tired of it and I'm going to get tired of it. So just that's the presumption from here on out, is I'm talking just about that kind of concept of biological species and speciations. So population genetics developed and also contributed significantly to the modern evolutionary synthesis connection between Darwinian natural selection of descent with modification and Mendelian genetics. And important here are the way in which alleles are found within distributed in frequencies in different populations. Alleles are alternative forms of a gene, and allele frequencies can change over time within a single population, and they frequently differ between populations. So what affects why allele frequencies shift or change? There are a lot of factors. These are thought to be some of the 5 most important factors for affecting allele frequencies. First, there's natural selection. There's sexual selection. Debates about the relationship between those two go on and on. There's mutations, there's genetic drift, and there's genetic flow. So for natural selection, alleles for fitter organisms become more frequent. That's how changes occur in allele frequencies within a population. For sexual selection, alleles for more sexually attractive species become more frequent. They may or may not, again, there are debates, they may or may not actually improve fitness in virtue of that. They just make mates more attractive for other mates. Mutations. These can generate new alleles into DNA. Genetic drift. So changes in allele frequency in a population that are due totally to chance. And these are just random changes that are indifferent to fitness. And these have a much bigger effect on small populations than they would have on large populations. And then there's gene flow. These are changes in allele frequency due to the mixing with genetically different populations. Often this happens through migration. Either a small population immigrates in or immigrates out. And when individual organisms with different genes find their way into a population and spread their alleles into it. Next, a quick word about mutations. So there are different mutations that occur in germ cells and then can be passed on to their offspring. But there's also mutations, and more likely often mutations that occur in somatic cells, which are going to be passed on to the daughter cells within the organism, but not passed on typically on this conception of things to their offspring. However, when we come back to, if I remember, when we come back to evolution in 4 dimensions and we talk about epigenetic factors, there actually are a lot of ways, even empirically discoverable, established ways, in which mutations in somatic cells can, in some ways, be passed on to offspring. There are 3 types of DNA mutations: base substitutions, deletions, and insertions. And the common causes of DNA mutations are that there are errors in DNA replication, errors in DNA recombination, there can be chemical damage to the DNA, or there can be radiation, which eventually brings about, causes chemical damage to DNA. The only reason I bring this up is because while it's not wrong, most of the Thomist literature I found has tended to focus on the way in which the sun in Aquinas does a lot for how certain spontaneous generations occur, and will often that be brought in for talking about why mutations occur. And so I don't want to say that's wrong to try to massage that and develop an innovative way of thinking through that. And Christopher Dakin has a long article on equivocal causation in Aquinas where he does this. But I just want to draw attention to that's not like the only or the major way in which mutations occur is through radiation or changes. Next, biological speciation. So the dominant form of biological speciation, especially on this concept that I've been dealing with, this Meyer biological species concept, doesn't occur through some sort of polyploidy where there's an instantaneous speciation that occurs. It occurs rather in a much more gradual, long-term shift in the reproductive mechanisms in a population such that they become 2 populations that are reproductively isolated. The illustration might be a little bit more helpful. So 4 different versions of speciation that occur: allopatric speciation, peripatric speciation, parapatric speciation, and sympatric speciation. So you can see in all of them they have the same original population. Then for any variety of reasons, there might be a flood, there might be a tornado or a hurricane, there might be a volcanic event. There's any sort of events that might cause some sort of geographical isolation of the original population. And over a long, long period of time, they make enough significant substantial changes, either ones that occur prezygotically or postzygotically, that eventually bring it about that they are reproductively isolated. Maybe they can't fertilize, or even if they can fertilize, whatever they fertilize is either a hybrid or it's something that can't be, it's self-fertile, it's something that's developmental plan or program is so problematic that it's not going to survive. The major form of speciation that occurs in plants, fish, reptiles, birds, and mammals is allopatric speciation. Given time, I'm not going to go through all of these. Sympatric speciation does occur, and Jerry Cohen has some very important contributions that he's made for thinking about sympatric speciation and making important differences between thinking of these different forms of speciation just in terms of biogeography and actually thinking about them in a more population genetics way of really thinking about what the genome is and allele frequencies. That's an important distinction which I don't have time to go into. But one thing he wants to draw attention to is that with sympatric speciation, this is where there isn't some sort of geographical isolation of them, that somehow a new polymorphism occurs within a population, and somehow they eventually become reproductively isolated despite the fact that they're not geographically isolated. So the reason why I'm hitting on this so much is because this is actually a much bigger challenge to a hylomorphic conception of speciation than accounts of instantaneous speciation that occurs from parents to offspring. This kind of speciation can't occur simultaneously. It takes an extraordinarily long span of time for these different populations to split up, become different populations, become populations that are eventually reproductively isolated from each other, and then technically become new biological species. But even some of them that do sexually reproduce, Coyne has said that up to 70% of angiosperm species have polyploidization events somewhere in their ancestry. So somewhere in their past, they didn't have just this form of allopatric or sympatric speciation. They actually had an instantaneous speciation due to a mutation. Now, the way I've been describing this is very much within the general gist of the modern evolutionary synthesis, which is very much focused on a gene-eye kind of view about it, that it's the distribution of alleles that really matters. What evolutionary and four dimensions, or the extended evolutionary synthesis focuses our attention on is that that story is perhaps a bit myopic, that there's more factors to be considered here. Jablonka and Lamb write in Evolution in Four Dimensions, heritable epigenetic differences may also play an important part in what Darwin called the mystery of mysteries, the origin of species. Speciation is a topic of evolutionary biologists argue about a lot. But most will agree that usually new species are initiated when populations become isolated from each other by a geographic or an ecological barrier. While separate, the populations change, and the changes that occur prevent them from interbreeding successfully when they meet up again. And it's usually assumed that the changes are genetic, but we believe that they may often be epigenetic. They also think that sometimes they can even, in fact, be behavioral. And one thing that Evolution in Four Dimensions, this book, does so well is it often takes us out of our world and puts us into certain thought experiments where you might have genomically fixed creatures, but yet they're able to engage in other sorts of activities that bring about gene regulation or bring about various epigenetic factors or behavioral factors that introduce variation into the populations of the species, variations that are inherited within the species, but inherited without genetic inheritance, to make the point of how it's just quite plausible and conceivable how various organisms could have epigenetic or behavioral variation and inheritance without genetic variation and inheritance. And then they bring us back to the world that we live in, where there is always going on genetic variation and inheritance, and give us some actual concrete empirical examples of where this very thing that they're describing has occurred. Here they're going to give us a slight taste of a discussion, or I'm going to give you a slight taste of a longer discussion where they're doing this for epigenetic variation and inheritance. During periods of isolation, two populations will commonly experience different conditions. Perhaps because one is colonizing a new island, or is using a new food source, or is experiencing a different climate. If so, new epigenetic marks might be induced in both somatic cells and germline cells. If so, they may do more than affect how well the organisms function in the new environment. They might also affect their ability to interbreed with other populations. If two previously isolated populations have acquired epigenetic variations, incompatibility between the marks transmitted by sperm and egg may prevent a hybrid embryo from developing normally. Even if a viable hybrid is produced, modified chromatin, is that right? chromatin? I'm asking the biologists to tell me. Marks may mean that gamete formation is upset and the hybrid is sterile. And this way, the formation of the initial reproductive barrier, that's the crucial part of speciation, can be an outcome of epigenetic rather than genetic changes. And in later chapters, they go through and make similar arguments for behavioral variation in inheritance. So all of this is just to set up what our big problem is for hylomorphic speciation and this account of the dominant account of speciation that occurs in reproductive communities is different views about how speciation, that is the origin and multiplication of new species from prior species, occurs. And you'll see that the hylomorphic account of speciation seems to be fundamentally incompatible with this biological speciation account. And this I have on your handout. So hylomorphic speciation first. It pertains to a new individual substance which is generated from other substances. But as we've just seen, biological speciation pertains to populations of individual substances. Second, for hylomorphic speciation, it occurs in a single intergenerational transformation. You'd have to have a new hylomorphic species that occurs from parent to offspring. It's instantaneous, or a single generation. Whereas biological speciation requires many, multiple generational transformations that gradually brings about a population that either can't interbreed with a population that was separated from it, they become reproductively isolated, or in theory, they've become isolated from the original population, which probably doesn't even exist anymore, or what the original organisms of the population were like. And then third, simultaneous change is required for hylomorphic speciation. This is something that Simon Koff brought up quite a bit in his talk a few weeks ago. That there's one substantial form displacing another's actualization of matter, and this occurs simultaneously because you can't have matter existing without a substantial form. And there's more to that in Aristotle's physics about why this is the case. Whereas for biological speciation, gradual change within populations of individuals over time, over an enormous time span, is required for speciation. So it seems like we can't reconcile them. So in the remaining part of the talk, I'm going to try to give an account about how to make these reconcilable with each other. All right. If you were wondering what hylomorphism is all this time, I'm sorry, but now we'll get to it. So hylomorphism is a doctrine in that the fundamental explanatory factors in physical reality are matter and form. Individual organisms are amongst the fundamental entities in the ontology of Aristotelian hylomorphism. All organisms or living substances are constituted from the unity or the union of organic matter animated by form. Form and matter are these ontological explanatory factors, and they explain the existence, the actuality, the essential or substantial identity, and the organization of individual organisms. There's different kinds of substantial form, or different kinds of form and matter. There's substantial and form and matter, and there's also a way of thinking about accidental form, or as Bernard Lonergan likes to call it, and I prefer for a number of reasons, conjugate form and matter. A substance grounds its conjugate propria, its powers, and its operations. Now for some modified slogans that I've taken from William Jaworski's account of hylomorphism. 3 slogans for substantial form. Substantial formal organization matters. It operates as an irreducible ontological principle, one that accounts at least in part for what things essentially are and what attributes they ground. Substantial formal organization makes a difference. It operates as an irreducible explanatory principle, one that accounts at least in part for what things can do and the powers they have. And substantial formal organization counts. It explains the unity of composite things, including the persistence of one and the same living individual through the dynamic influx and efflux of matter and energy that characterize many of its interactions with the world. And 3 modified slogans for accidental or conjugate forms, drawing on Lonergan and Jaworski. Conjugate, or accidental, formal organization matters. It's an irreducible ontological principle that organized activities possess essentially, and which in part account for the very nature of what the activities are and that they organize. Conjugate formal organization makes a difference because it's the form of a power which provides an irreducible explanatory principle, and powers enable individuals to engage in organized activities that they could not perform without these powers. And then conjugate formal organization counts. It confers unity on diverse events in a way that's similar to how substantial forms confirm unity on physical materials that composed organized individual substances. Okay. Now, there are some rival versions of hylomorphism on substantial form as transformative, and these are all using Rob Kuhn's account of staunch hylomorphism. I take these to be two versions of staunch hylomorphism. Minimal transformationism is one version of staunch hylomorphism. That's the kind that Jaworski defends. And this is the view that's pretty similar to a medieval view of plurality of substantial forms. It's the view that these substantial forms unite and actualize the powers of organized components, but they do not make those components into what they are necessarily. Components can have substantial identity independent of another unifying substantial form. Whereas substantive transformationism, this is an orthodox Aristotelian Thomist view of substantial form. These forms unite, actualize, and they transform components, and the forms make their components to be what they are. So all the material stuff in me is me. It's not something else. It's been transformed. All the hydrogen and carbon that you could acquire out of me, it's not actually hydrogen and carbon when it's a part of me. It's been assimilated and completely into my substantial nature. Components derive their substantial identity solely from a single unifying substantial form. So we're not going to adjudicate that debate here, but it would have relevance to this debate in different interesting ways. Now the relationship of hylomorphism to natural kinds. We need to distinguish that issues from that what and which issues. So Aristotelians are pretty confident that we know that all individual organisms are constituted by some substantial form and matter based on our ontological analysis of conjugate changes and substantial changes of these individual substances. Where we're a bit foggy in the dark is the question of how to answer what the hylomorphic species essence or nature of an individual organism is in full detail. And how do we know which substantial form it has? As Aquinas writes, interestingly enough, in his commentary on the Apostles' Creed, our manner of knowing is so weak that no philosopher could perfectly investigate the nature of even one little fly. So we're honest about how little we know about what are the details we would want to give of the specific differences of substantial, of hylomorphic species or essences. So Aristotelian hylomorphism maintains that we only know what specifically differentiates and identifies a hylomorphic species or nature via knowing the propria that a hylomorphic species ontologically grounds. Propria is on the non-accidental side of Porphyry's 5 predicables. Of the essential side has genus-specific difference in species, and then on the non-essential side you have propria and you have accidents. I'm slightly tweaking what propria means, though, in that context here. Propria detail the necessary, sufficient, and with a nod to our Wittgensteinian friends, the criterial attributes that belong to the essence, the nature of a hylomorphic substance. And I think this is an adequate nod, a helpful nod, because it's a very Aristotelian nod of making a gesture towards things that are always or for the most part. Now, this means I'm also kind of slightly modifying how natural kinds are used for thinking about biological species. On my account, biological science has empirically established the natural kinds of biological species. That is, what are the necessary, sufficient, and the always or for the most part, or criterial conditions, for including an individual organism in a natural kind. For those who are familiar with the work of Philippa Foot or Michael Thompson, Life in Action, or his representing life, he has a really rich, I think, detailed account of Aristotelian categoricals, or what he calls natural history judgments, and why they're not statistical, and why they don't have a bunch of other characterizations. This is kind of what I have in mind if you wanted to really fill out in a much more detailed way what I have in mind here. Drawing on some of the work of Travis Dumsday, it's important that we recognize that not all natural kinds can or need to fit the neat and tidy natural kinds, like electrons, of fundamental physics. They might be like the focal meaning or the paradigm of the clarity of natural kinds that we can arrive at, ones where there are necessary and jointly sufficient conditions that we can detail very quickly. But we can't require all individual hylomorphic substances to have to meet that same very rigid and clean sort of criteria for natural kinds. As Ramsey, I think, argues to great effect, is the more complex an entity is, the more its properties can actually vary while remaining the same kind of entity. So we shouldn't model the natural kinds of the nature of a biological organism on the simplicity of fundamental particles. They need to have their own apt and suited account of natural kinds that actually respects the complexity of their nature, a nature that allows for variation in its properties. It's natural for biological organisms of the same species, phenotypic and genotypic traits to vary significantly. If that wasn't true, you wouldn't have the range of developmental features that are different or the range of phylogenetic diversity that allows for evolution. Hylomorphic species needs to detail substantive answers to ontological questions that brush up against scientific questions about the biological natural kinds that detail what biological species are. So we can't just have this very abstract account. We need to come down and the rubber needs to hit the road and provide a more detailed account of how this account applies to biological kinds. Ramsey writes in an article that just came out last year, what, if anything, grounds and unifies the collection of intrinsic properties generally taken to be definitive of organism, properties such as metabolism, capacity for reproduction, capacity for adaptation? This issue is often left wholly unaddressed in the existing literature on the nature and the origin of life, and constitutes one possible opening for the introduction of substantial form into the discussion, an introduction that would in turn help draw out the tight connection between classification and explanation that is such a prominent feature of scholastic philosophy of nature. So we've got this kind of natural kinds that are often used in the biological sciences for thinking about speciation. Why should we bring in substantial forms in hylomorphic species? It's because there's certain ontological issues that have been left unaddressed by the accounts of natural kinds. Natural kinds, importantly, are detailed by the sciences are not equivalent to hylomorphic essences. You might call natural kinds essences, but they're not hylomorphic essences. They're essences of propria, not essences of the underlying substance that grounds the propria. Natural kinds designate the empirically established propria that are grounded in the substantial form of an organism's hylomorphic essence or nature. In short, hylomorphic essences and natural kind propria fill two different explanatory needs. Hylomorphic essences provide ontic explanans of fundamental ontology concerning the actualization, the organization, and the unity of an entire entity and its propria and other attributes. Whereas natural kinds, established from the sciences, these provide explanatio for the empirically discoverable propria of biological species. So I'm following Travis pretty close here. There's some difference of disagreement here, minor, between Oderberg's account, but they're still pretty similar here. So the challenge for us is to show how hylomorphism can provide an ontological explanation that would integrate all the true explanations detailed by otherwise conflicting conceptions of species and biological natural kinds. So a much more ambitious, bigger project would be to say that some of the conflicts that come up about different species concepts happen because they're looking at different kinds of life forms themselves that are going to have different forms of species and speciation. So they're not necessarily in conflict, but providing an account for a way in which hylomorphic account of species can actually provide a unification for the different kinds of hylomorphic species that have different kinds of natural kinds that specify the propria of those species. So we might be able to find a way to unite Meyer's biological species concept in some contexts and have a hylomorphic account that would ground the way in which phylogenetic species concepts work elsewhere, as well as we would need to, in concert with some of the biological accounts of asexual reproducing species, provide an account for hylomorphic ways in which hylomorphic substances ground those propria. So that's a much more ambitious project. Like I said, if I haven't been hand-waving enough, I'm hand-waving even more on this first point. That's kind of what I'm trying to detail how to do. So hylomorphism, ontogenesis, and phylogenesis. One problem with hylomorphic approaches is kind of a failure to think about development and how much species actually develop, organisms develop in their own individual lives. And what hylomorphic species concepts, as well as natural kind concepts of biological species, need to be more attuned to is that these are going to ground propria that need to accommodate the facts of ontogenesis and phylogenesis. So a lot of the objections to natural kind conceptions of species is they tend to think that they have to have all these intrinsic properties, and if they lack any of the intrinsic properties, they fail to have the natural kind. But biological species are the kind of things that just vary a lot in their intrinsic properties. Therefore, essentialism has to be false. There can't be natural biological kinds. Part of what I'm saying is because they are biological organisms, they are organisms that exhibit ontogeny. They're organisms that exhibit development. And the kind of organism that exhibits development, unlike an electron, is the kind of organism that throughout the stages of its life varies in its intrinsic properties and its relations. So they've kind of begged the question against natural kinds by not even considering the sort of organisms living organisms are. They are the kind of organisms that exhibit developmental variations and changes. And that's also going to be true of phylogenesis. So for ontogenesis or ontogeny, we need to say developing individual organisms exhibit genetic, epigenetic, and behavioral variations in their developing propria throughout distinct stages of their specific developmental programs. They just vary. That's what kind of natural kind they have. It's the kind of natural kind that involves a lot of variations. And similarly, for phylogenesis, developing populations of a species exhibit genetic, epigenetic, and behavioral variations, sometimes heritable variations, in their developing propria. And a lot more detail of this can be put forward in looking at treatments in the extended evolutionary synthesis of how these things hang together. All right, some objections to what I put forward so far. The strongest objection that's quite well known, it's already come up in the seminar, is that hylomorphism is a form of essentialism, and essentialism is incompatible with evolution because there are a lot of reasons. Here's two, I think, more substantive ones. Species are defined by populations or, relationally, by lineages, and essences define intrinsic properties belonging to individuals of a specific kind or type. Second, essences and hylomorphic species are fixed, and biological species change via evolutionary processes. For essentialist responses to some of these kinds of objections, see Oderberg, Travis Dumsday, Stephen Bolter, and Christopher Offson's recent monograph. I'm going to give two short responses. To the first objection, we've already seen that this first objection actually misrepresents hylomorphic essentialism. The substance of a hylomorphic species grounds its natural kind propria, which can include variable intrinsic and relational attributes. So we're not trying to adopt the model of natural kinds of fundamental physical particles to try to account for the natural kind of varying ontogenic variation and phylogenetic variations of organisms. The natural kinds need to be suited to those kinds of biological organisms. And furthermore, natural kinds aren't the same thing as the essences themselves. The essences ground these natural kinds, which are the propria of a hylomorphic species or essence. Furthermore, it's in virtue of propria, powers pertaining to reproduction, that populations become reproductively isolated. So you're going to need some natural kinds, some propria, namely mechanisms for reproductive isolation, in order to get populations that can be reproductively isolated. So you're not doing away with the propria. You need certain powers that are going to be intrinsic to all the organisms in a population that are reproductively isolated from another population. So you actually haven't done away with these natural kind features. Likewise, for these more relational accounts, these more phylogenetic accounts, it's in virtue of similar propria that as relata specify and identify relational lineages and their branching events. You can't have the relations without the relata, and the relata are ultimately going to rely upon some sort of intrinsic properties to specify them and clarify what they are. For a more detailed version of this argument, see this article of Travis Dumsday, which I've drawn on him for this. The second objection, essences and hylomorphic species are fixed, and biological species change via evolutionary processes, so it seems that they're incompatible. The response is twofold. First, biological essences are not fixed, and second, essentialism is actually essential to evolution. That doesn't mean hylomorphic essentialism is essential to evolution. That's another further argument, because there are rival versions of essentialism. And hylomorphism has, I think, some particular issues that we have to get over, namely some of the ones I'm talking about in this talk. So, response to the first one. Biological essences are not problematically fixed for the ontogenetic and phylogenetic makes, based on the points I just made about ontogeny and phylogeny. Hylomorphic essences ground and unify sometimes highly variable genetic, epigenetic, and behavioral natural kind propria. So they're not fixed. Second, essentialism is essential to evolution. That's a rather surprising turn of events, but this is a more offensive kind of argument that Stephen Bolter has developed in his Metaphysics from a Biological Point of View, as well as in Dumsday and Austin. Bolter writes, the standard account of biological diversity, and this quote's on your handout if you can't see from way back in the back. The standard account, it's in the middle, right above section 3 on the first page. The standard account of biological diversity provided by evolutionary theory presupposes essentialism. Note that this argument is built on the fact that species do come into and pass out of existence, even if they're populations of reproductively isolated organisms. A fact that is often thought actually to be inimical to essentialism. In fact, quite the reverse is the case. Only if species have distinct essences can one say in a principled fashion that one species no longer exists and that two new distinct species have arrived on the scene. And one needs to be able to say this if one is to give the standard account of biological diversity. And a few pages later, it's a much more detailed argument. I'm just summarizing some of the key conclusions. It is possible to maintain that A, B, and C are distinct, natural species, only if the existence and the identity conditions, that is, the essences of each of them, are distinct. Okay. All right. I promise we actually are in section 3, I just didn't change the numbering. So this is really about hylomorphism and adductive speciation, but the topic is the origin of ontological species. So how do new ontological species originate? The kind of picture I'm putting forward here is what I'm, for lack of a better term, referring to as Thomist hylomorphic naturalism. Not naturalism in the form of atheism, naturalism in the form that the secondary causes that God has created the cosmos to have are sufficient for bringing about the evolution of all these species, these hylomorphic speciation events. The totality of created secondary causes in nature, that's nature with all caps for a reason, it's like the totality of the physical cosmos as is developing, have the power to adduce novel substantial forms, and therefore essences and species, from the proximate potentialities latent in other hylomorphic substances. So the idea is that the total potentiality for every physical hylomorphic substance is in the cosmos somewhere. It just needs enough ratchet effects to bring out the required proximate powers for adducing them. But the total local causes are going to be sufficient for adducing them. But you couldn't at the beginning of the Big Bang just suddenly have whatever exists there adduce octopuses. You need to have a ratcheting effect of a lot of developed dispositions and new substance come on the scene that acquire various powers that can then, through a nexus of interactions, adduce these powers. This is being contrasted then from what I'm calling Thomist supernaturalism. And this would be a view that the origin of all or some novel substantial forms and essences species requires God's miraculous or special intervention into the created order of nature. Secondary causes that God has created within the cosmos are not sufficient to originate novel ontological species in the cosmos. So I'm working from out of that first version, that first thesis, that Thomistic hylomorphic naturalism, not the Thomistic supernaturalism. So on this account, God created from eternity a cosmos, that is nature, endowed with all the secondary causal potentialities required as secondary causes to eventually bring about the adduction of all fundamental particles, of atoms, of molecules, of solar and planetary systems, of abiogenesis, of the evolution of all living organisms, including the emergence of sentient conscious animals. The only exception is the standard Thomist and Catholic exception, is that the immaterial rational soul of humans, which cannot be adduced for any totality of hylomorphic secondary substances in principle, and this is because there's no material potentiality for an immaterial form. Now, an important thing that's often overlooked in accounts of Aristotelian hylomorphic substances is that substantial change actually has a lot of varieties. We often talk about substantial change just in terms of the generation of one substance and while simultaneously corrupting the prior substance. But actually in Aquinas and Aristotle, there's a variety of different types of substantial change. That is, all this changes that belong to categories, not just accidental changes in quantity, like augmentation or diminution, or changes in quality, like alterations, or changes in location or place, local motion. There's also a whole bunch of subdivisions of varieties of substantial changes. There's also substantial ontogenesis, and so that's the organogenesis, the genesis of different organs, as well as the development of an embryo to a fetus, to an infant, to an adolescent, and so on. These are all types of substantial changes that have their consequent or the resulting accidental changes too, but they're technically substantial changes as well. They're changes in the very organization of the substance, not just their accidental changes. There's also what I call substantial fusion. This has to do with the integration without corruption of retrievable elements and molecules in a substance. This is sometimes talked about in terms of virtual presence, the virtual presence of water or carbon in a living organism. Their key feature is that they're integrated without corruption, but they're retrievable. And then there's this new thing I'm introducing that Aquinas certainly didn't talk about, but it probably isn't too far away from what he had in mind when he talks about spontaneous generation, or the generation of a mule from a horse and a donkey. This is what I'm going to call adductive speciation. But if you all hate the term, you can tell me, and we can try to work out a better term, or if this is all needs to be abandoned, that might be. It might not be an adaptation. It might not have the fitness to survive. This is the generation of a novel hylomorphic substance by the total proximate equivocal secondary causes, which adduce a novel substantial form from the proximate potentialities of a nexus of interacting hylomorphic substances. I'm going to do my best to unpack that in the time remaining. But at least it's on your handout at the very bottom of the first page. All right, so what do I mean here? First off, there's a temptation and error of Aristotelian hylomorphists to tend to atomize hylomorphic substances. So we're really great critics of atomism, of just thinking about reductive fundamental particles explaining everything from the bottom up. But we also have a tendency to sort of isolate our hylomorphic substances and tell our story there, but they then become just sort of barely interacting atomic substances, and we don't think enough about them in terms of systems, the way in which they function within nature with the capital letters, or a cosmos. How are they always constantly engaged? So cosmos, or nature, forgot the capitals, is comprised of an ongoing local and global nexus of co-manifesting powers of interacting animate and inanimate substances. So whenever an agent acts, it's only able to act because it's manifesting passive potentialities, passive powers, and other substances around. And they're also simultaneously, their active powers are co-manifesting with some of my passive powers. So any substance that acts is always acting in a system with other substances, and we're all equally, in reciprocal ways, power coupling. Whenever you act, there's a power coupling. By speaking, I'm engaging a series of powers in me that are being co-manifested for the sake of production of speech. You all have an auditory system that's being manifested because it's a passive potency to receive speech, and so on and so forth. From the fundamental physics level all the way up into the neuroscience and the psychology, there's a whole spectrum of continuous ongoing active and passive powers coupling and decoupling with each other as we all go about our interaction as hylomorphic substances. So we need to have that view in mind. And that's what I mean by cosmos, or nature. It's the perspective of not just an individual hylomorphic substance of a nature acting, but how that fits within a much bigger picture, a developing picture of all of these natures interacting with each other in various ways. Now, as the atomized picture is very good at telling us, all of these different substances have their natural powers, and those powers have natural termini, natural ends, that they have tendencies or inclinations towards. And so water's ability to boil or water's ability to change other phase states, those are various tendencies that under certain circumstances the water will boil or will freeze under those conditions. The powers of reproduction have a certain sort of orientation and direction. The powers of DNA replication, of translation and transcription, these have certain natural tendencies that they tend towards. Okay? But in doing that, they're also bringing about and actualizing and co-manifesting the passive powers of the other things around them. And what occurs in this is a lot of different natural variations. So sticking to the natural teleology of these powers, what they're ordered towards, there's going to be variations among the manifestations of the natural termini of these co-manifesting powers. Okay? They're not always going to perform their natural action in the exact same way every single time. More importantly, for the context of hylomorphic speciation, simultaneous to this, there's always a spectrum of different chance events. Remember, the Aristotelian account of chance is not something that's a per se cause. A chance event is rather the convergence of already two or more teleologically directed causes which have some incidental result to them. So any chance event is underwritten by teleological operations. But these chance variations are pretty complicated, and they come a variety of ways. And if we start thinking not about atomized hylomorphic substances, but as a cosmos of a nexus of interacting, always ongoing interactions of co-manifesting powers, we realize that chance variations bring about convergent manifestations, convergent operations, which are incidental to the natural termini of these co-manifesting powers. So in having DNA replication, there can be replication errors, where DNA bases get substituted or deleted, and that can just be a chance event that it can occur. But in virtue of that chance event can occur, not always is it going to not encode for something that could be a viable functional protein. Occasionally, it's actually going to be a chance variation and replication that could be then used to encode for a protein that turns out to be a viable protein, a functional protein. So there are different kinds of chance variations. There are errors, there are impediments to co-manifestations of these natural termini, but there's also not just all sorts of chances, there's probabilities for these things to occur. So Aristotle's example is someone who meets a friend at the market and someone owes them money, and they are both going to the market for market reasons, not to pay back the money, but it's an occasion for that to occur. But if these people go to the market every single day, that increases the probability that that chance event is going to occur. Similarly, all these different teleological powers that are interacting, some of them there's a convergence or a higher probability that increases, and it can increase over time based upon a lot of other factors, the reasons for these chance events to happen. So these probabilities can converge and increase due to various genetic, epigenetic, behavioral, and ecological factors. And this long process is what I'm going to describe as a sort of cosmic ratcheting in nature, or you could also describe it as providence. All right, I'm almost done. So these chance variations sometimes introduce ontogenetic and phylogenetic, and then these are the different kinds of things that they sometimes introduce. Sometimes they introduce novel conjugate attributes, novel accidental attributes. Sometimes those novel conjugate attributes become propria. So they become not just something that happens to the organism, it develops a certain color that's just a random color, or it develops an extra toe, or it develops an extra foot, or it develops photosensitive cells on its skin surface. And so some of them are just random flukes that don't have any fitness value. They're not adaptations in any way whatsoever. But sometimes they not only become adaptations, not only become something that improves fitness, sometimes they become nearly indispensable to the kind of organism they are. They shift from being an accidental or conjugate attribute to becoming a propria. They become something that's like distinctive of that kind of being. Not just a being that sings songs, a bird that sings songs, but the whole population becomes a population of birds that sing songs, and this becomes indispensable to the kind of mating activity that these birds engage in. Sometimes these novel conjugate propria eventually supersede their prior propria. So the things that made those birds in terms of natural kinds to be what they are, have been left behind, and this new propria have taken over in a population. And this happens enough, you'll have what was described before as biological speciation. So you have the accumulated propria in a population of organisms that renders them eventually to be a reproductively isolated population. And then finally, what is basically this account of hylomorphic speciation that I'm giving is that if you've had a population where there's been accumulated complete transformation, not just a biological speciation event, but there's become a stabilization and a new integration of all of these new propria from the original population to the population they were split from. These accumulated propria surpass a critical threshold that the hylomorphic substances developmental program cannot maintain. So basically, the propria of the new biological species developmental program, which was still being sustained on the old substantial form, so to speak, it eventually becomes too monstrous vis-a-vis the hylomorphic species. So again, remember the hylomorphic species substantial form is what grounds all of its propria. If you have a population that dramatically changes in not just its conjugate attributes, but even the propria of its conjugate attributes, you have a being that is able to sustain rather monstrously all these different propria so that it still has, it has a new developmental program, that's a kind of natural kind of propria, but it has ones that are so monstrous to what the substantial form is supposed to be grounding, the kind of attributes and powers that it's supposed to ground, that a threshold is reached where there's an entirely new ontological integration that's adduced in order to sustain this new developmental program that's so radically different from the other. And as I say here, this results in the adduction of a new hylomorphic species and the offspring. So there's a lot of hand-waving there, I realize. But that's basically the picture that I'm putting forward of how you would try to give an account for how the hylomorphic species account could be compatible to the biological species concept. It's one in which where gradually a population is changed so dramatically that it's acquired new natural kinds that are the reason for its reproductive isolation. After that biological speciation event has occurred in the population, it comes to be the case that from one offspring, or one parent to offspring, there has to be a completely new substantial form transition that is required in order to stabilize this new developmental program. All right, so I'm going to conclude then with a question. What criteria are there for when hylomorphic speciation has occurred? And remember my earlier point about we need to distinguish that from what and which. So the hylomorphous Aristotelians are really confident for a lot of reasons about that there are substantial forms for all these individual organisms. But what we don't know are the details of what the species or the essence or the nature of an individual organism is, and we don't know which substantial form it has. So I'm trying to give an account of if you have biological speciation, eventually there's going to come a time in which they become so dramatically different that you have to have an adduction of a new hylomorphic species. But I don't know the answer to what the criteria is for when that occurs, when you have gone from one kind of species substantial form to a new kind. So I think that's a great question. And I think in a way that I'm not going to be able to detail here, that the extended evolutionary synthesis, and in particular evolution in 4 dimensions, can help delineate when a total shift in the integration and the unification of new genetic, epigenetic, and behavioral natural kind propria has occurred, requiring a new hylomorphic species to ground them. And just so you know what's on the back side of your handout, this is the book Evolution in 4 Dimensions. But what they're showing at the top of this handout is, and this is from this paper on the extended evolutionary synthesis with Leyland, Jablonka, and a bunch of others, published in 2015. The top is the model of how the modern evolutionary synthesis functions. You can see it's very genome up-centered, and inheritance just goes from the genome across. Hylomorphism is an account, like I described, in this cosmic view, where there's lots of co-manifesting powers. The organism is co-manifesting its genomic, its cellular, its organism, and environmental powers all simultaneously. And what evolution in 4 dimensions and the extended evolutionary synthesis are trying to get at is this bottom picture, where you have this sort of reciprocal constructive causation that's going always from the environment down to the organism, the cell, and the genome, and going up. But you also have forms of inheritance that are also going across these different levels as well. And I think that's the place to look at what it looks for like for an organism to transform in these different levels its developmental program. So it becomes a population where they've radically changed what their natural kind propria are. And it's there that you're going to begin to start detailing what it would be for a metaphysical account for how a threshold has been reached in which a new form of hylomorphic speciation has to be adduced. So, I've gone a bit over time. Thank you very much for your patience, and I look forward to your questions.